The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. Now, here's your host, Tony D'Angelo.
And a good afternoon to you, Mike Du Bois, and a good afternoon to everyone out there. This is Tony D'Angelo broadcasting for and from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network out of Alameda, California. And this is our special audio podcast afternoon edition of Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. And I am honored to have this particular guest. Her name is Pamela Glasner. She is the producer of a film called Last Will and Embezzlement, talking about the last days of Mickey Rooney, the great entertainer, the consummate entertainer, and what he was dealing with towards the end of his life. And Pamela comes into this particular project through some personal experience. And the subject that we're going to be talking about today, particularly to Mickey, and globally, if you will, which is really kind of the, shall we say, the whisper epidemic in this society, as far as I'm concerned, is the subject of financial elder abuse, more specifically. So first of all, Pamela, good afternoon, and such a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thanks so much. And in reading about this, it's very funny. I am involved with the project of Fiduciary Elder Care Services, as our mutual friend Judy Heft had mentioned. And I had dug deep into my files, and I found an article, December 22nd, 2006, from the New York Post concerning the mistreatment of Mickey Rooney. And at this point, it was suspect, and people are making rumors, and there's these terrible things happening. And Mickey Rooney, at one point, goes before the United States Senate and essentially says, "Hey guys, this is terrible. I'm being abused, and nobody did anything. And poor Mickey." And I personally take this to heart because I'm a big Mickey fan. The man is just such a legend. He was the Mick in entertainment. But I want to talk about you, how you came into this project, and what you yourself personally experienced as you put it together.
Okay, all right. Well, first, while we're talking, there are some numbers that I would like your audience to keep in mind.
Certainly.
39 million, that's how many people, senior citizens, there are living in the country right now. 78 million, which is the number of baby boomers living in the country right now. 11,000. That's how many baby boomers are turning 65 years old every single day. And 80%, meaning that baby boomers control 80% of this country's, and in fact the world's, spendable cash. Now, I'm not talking about corporate money. I'm talking about discretionary cash that human beings have. And that's an awful lot of money. And what's happening is with this cohort of seniors, and then the upcoming generation of seniors, which is the baby boomers, we are headed right now towards the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. And that's very important because anytime you have money, you've got thieves out there with their hands out trying to take it. And the way that I came into this project was I actually had heard about Mickey testifying before Congress, but really in my life, it was just a peripheral thing. I heard about it, and oh, poor Mickey, I adored him too. But it was something that was far removed. And then my mom passed away. She and my dad were living in Florida. And my dad was living, I beg your pardon, by that time my dad was living full-time in a nursing home about a mile away from their house. And when my mom passed away, my brother, who also lives in Florida, about 300 miles away from the town they lived in, he called the nursing home to let them know that he was going to be taking over the day-to-day responsibility of my dad's care, which made sense. He lives in Florida, and I'm all the way up here in Connecticut. And the social worker said, well, that's really nice, Mr. Glasner, but you don't need to worry about anything because your brother is taking care of everything. And my brother said, I don't have a brother. And that was how we found out that somebody had insinuated himself into my parents' lives.
Oh, brother. Okay.
Yes. So, the next phone call that my brother got was from their corporate counsel. And we ran down there. This man had come in with fake papers. My dad was an Alzheimer's patient. But in the state of Florida, you can put a document in front of somebody who has Alzheimer's because they say that a person with Alzheimer's can have what they refer to as a lucid moment.
Oh, for sure. We go through that all the time in trusts and estates. Please continue.
Yes, that's right. So you are familiar with that. Your audience may not be. So you could put a paper in front of an Alzheimer's patient who would sign it, and then another person could come in right behind you 10 minutes later and put a completely different paper, and that person would sign it, and you could actually end up using the elderly person as a ping pong ball. And so he had these documents, and basically he had full charge of everything. So I went down, obviously I went down to Florida for my mom's funeral, and after the funeral I was alone in my parents' house, and the perpetrator showed up, and he told me that he was somebody that they met at the synagogue. Synagogues and churches are fabulous hunting grounds for victims because you always expect the smiling face to be attached to an honest person. And so he had met them at the synagogue, and then my mom, after my dad went into the nursing home, my mom, who was 89, she was 89 when she passed away, so she was about 86 or 87 when she first met this guy. For the first time in all her years, she was living alone. Even though my dad was a mile away, she was still living alone. And this man, if your kids really cared about you, they'd be here for you, and let me drive you to the hairdresser, and let me drive you to the doctor. And of course, all of this is in retrospect. We had no idea this was going on.
Yes, ma'am.
So he came to the house, and he told me that he had gotten his name on my parents' wills, both of them, as the executor. He had gotten his name on my parents' checking accounts, and he said, so all of the money, and he said, and all the money in the checking accounts, that's now mine now that your mother is dead. And he said that he was going to sell the house, and that he was going to keep the proceeds of the house because that was also his, as far as he was concerned. And I went to the police because, in fact, Mickey was testifying before Congress, not so much because there aren't laws, but because there are no teeth behind those laws. There are plenty of laws in Florida protecting the elderly, but the police aren't educated, and they just did not. When I went to them and I told them everything that had happened, that the perpetrator actually admitted what he had done and bragged about it, the police officer said, the detective said, oh yeah, you know what, ma'am, we hear about this kind of thing all the time.
Oh, wonderful.
The extent of their participation in the whole thing.
Now, if I could just stop you for a second. Like so many things in life, we become expert in what they are after we've been through them, kind of wishing we didn't go through them. This is kind of like my life with computer systems. I know more about that than probably what I had for dinner the last 3 nights. As an example, I never intended to, but running a business and you have issues, you tend to learn a lot. What were you professionally or by trade before you got involved with any of these quote-unquote elder fraud issues?
By education, I'm a teacher.
Okay, please continue. I think that's relevant.
I'm an author, and I do write about, as a kind of like with an advocate's voice, but I knew nothing about this.
Understand.
Nothing. But I started
Gee, when are you going to collect your pension? Okay, please continue.
So I called after 6 weeks of banging my head against the wall and not getting anywhere. I mean, I even told them that my father's gun was missing because I thought if they don't give a damn about my parents, maybe they'll care about a gun. But no, they didn't care about that either. So I called my then business partner because we had already been working on another film project, and I said, you know what? We need to drop everything and we need to make a documentary about this because I had heard about, of course, Mickey Rooney, and I thought if we could get Mickey Rooney to at least make some comments, in an interview in the film, that it could be a pretty powerful thing because I found out just how prevalent this kind of activity is. I mean, it really is a cottage business in the United States right now. There's no financial outlay. You're almost guaranteed not to be prosecuted because the victims, as you know, the victims are almost always loath to report. They're either very humiliated or most often it's a family member who's abusing them, and a lot of times that family member will be their only connection to the outside world. So they could be afraid. They could also be suffering, physical abuse. And if you tell anybody, you'll be in worse shape than you were before, kind of thing. So most of these crimes go unreported, and then even when they are reported, like in my case, they didn't do anything. Elderly people, unfortunately, make very, very bad witnesses. They grew up in a much less litigious world than you and I are living in right now. They did business on a handshake. They didn't go to court. A lot of times the elderly people are helpless. And we made this film, and I'll tell you honestly, aside from the fact that it was incredibly cathartic, because going through that, knowing that my parents died in poverty, and it wasn't just the money. I mean, they were aware. My mom, well, not my dad so much, but my mom at the end was aware from what other people told me of what she had done, that she had invited the stranger in, and she would never tell me. I had no idea she was probably that humiliated. But anyway, so in the course of doing all of this, it helped me heal. And then now the film is in places like it's a 23-minute film that I use for my presentations, and there are places like district attorneys use it. They play it for their elderly clients who are not inclined to speak out, but in one part of the film, Mickey looks directly into the camera and he says, if it can happen to Mickey Rooney, it can happen to anybody.
I saw that.
People are encouraged to speak. But Penn State uses it, Holy Cross University uses it in their law courses.
Now, if I can just stop you here for a moment, this is the ghost of my 6th grade teacher is yelling, Tony, irrelevant and immaterial. What happened to the perpetrator of this crime? Did he just skate off with the money?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. He walked off with 6 figures and absolutely no consequences. The detective who was supposed to be investigating sent me an email saying that she had spoken to him and that he said, and that he seemed to have my parents' best interest in heart.
Wonderful. And my second question is this. I mean, I've always said in my life that if you want to walk on the most brain dead place in the world, you walk on a college campus. People are wandering all over the place and nobody really seems to know where they're going, and nobody really cares as to, who's wandering, what to wear, to whom, or whatever. And the security office is usually sitting there behind glass doors somewhere. Now, in and out of the elderly facilities and the nursing homes, well, this is a big runner-up as far as quote-unquote watching who comes, who goes. I could tell you some horror stories about some of the fine institutions here in our mutual lovely state, but you who, of course, have played the what-if game, Pamela, 10,000 times in your life, is there something that could have been done at the facility level to stop this man from walking in and sticking this paper under your dad's nose?
There could have been. There are facilities that actually have like a gatehouse.
Mm-hmm.
You know how that there are, especially down in Florida, lots of gated communities?
Yes, yes.
There are facilities like that, but they really are few and far between. And now there was a front desk, and you were supposed to sign in.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people did sign in, but there was nobody standing there blocking your way if you didn't sign in, so I don't know quite how secure it was. But I'll tell you honestly, I mean, obviously they knew. Once my brother and I went down there, once my brother said, I don't have a brother, they all realized that they were
Sure.
in great part responsible for this. And yet when I went down there, the director of the facility came out and challenged me. I mean, literally right there in the foyer was, she wasn't exactly yelling, but she had a raised voice telling me that I had no right to just show up. I had to call and make an appointment. Now, my dad was still alive at the time. And I said, I don't have to make an appointment to see my father. And my sister-in-law, who's no bigger than a minute and blind with a guide dog, got herself in between me and the director and dressed her down. I mean, but this woman was attacking me, the daughter, and yet she allowed a man who, I'll tell you, Tony, it's really weird. If my last name is different than my father's last name, that would be common because a lot of women, when they get married, they take on a new name, right?
Right.
But the perpetrator's last name was not the same as my father's last name. And how they thought this man was my father's son, it just makes absolutely no sense to me.
And I guess, so really what we're saying is that any elderly facility, now this is my pea brain at work, please correct me if I'm wrong, any elderly facility that has a quote-unquote free campus, much like the colleges and universities we have described, really is a point of risk of anybody kind of walking in and doing whatever, provided they've gained the trust of these, elderly people.
Well, it's not just yes, you are right, but it could really be any place.
Any place.
It could be synagogues. It can be community centers.
Yeah.
Any place where somebody isn't. You don't want to get to the point where you're being so strict about relationships
Mm-hmm.
that you're trying to, monitor everything that everybody says and everybody does. But this is such a big problem, and not every cross-generational relationship is a bad thing. And when somebody who is of a completely different generation, meaning the man who abused my parents, comes into their lives and then suddenly starts taking over, someone should be asking questions. And there are organizations that do what we call feet on the ground. There are organizations that will actually, they exist specifically to do well-being checks on the seniors, making sure they're taking their medicine, making sure their checking account isn't suddenly being emptied out, making sure that the house is being taken care of properly, and if the roof does need to be fixed, that the people that they're signing a contract with is somebody who is genuinely doing the work, not just taking the deposit and then going away.
Yeah, for certain. And, it's like as I was reading and thinking about this last night, the school teachers, you being one, you have an obligation. School teachers have an obligation if they see a child who they believe is the subject of abuse to say something. Otherwise, they are accountable for it and perhaps can be prosecuted for, missing the boat entirely. What amazes me as I think about it is we have a regulatory body in the securities industries, FINRA, which in many cases, this is my humble opinion, are about as useful as a paper tiger. And so much of this mishigas, if I may use the Hebrew, just passes right under the noses of the financial industry and financial counselors and reps and brokers and things like that. Even those in my profession, the legal profession, the tax profession, any of us holding licenses, and we're not held accountable for it. And frankly, I think it's a shame. I think it's the power of lobbies, frankly, but. It's oh really? Was that not his son? Gee, I didn't know that. I mean, this is what we're saying.
I think it goes from state to state.
Yeah.
Banks are generally mandatory reporters, but I don't know. I don't think it happened in Florida because what happened was about 3 years before this happened. I got a phone call from my mom saying that because she and we had worked something out with our CPA, and I was helping my parents out a little bit financially. So my husband and I were taking my parents as deductions on our tax, as dependents.
As dependents, yeah.
On our tax returns, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my mom called me up and she said, Daddy and I don't want to be your dependents anymore. And I had my accountant call her because financially speaking, it made no sense. But, they're adults. They have the right to do this. They have every right to make a decision about how they want to do their money. I mean, even if they want to do a big bonfire in the backyard and burn all their money, it's not a very smart thing to do, but they
would have that right.
To do that.
Yeah.
And so we tried to dissuade them, but she said, we just don't like the idea of being your dependent. After all of this happened, and we ended up getting some professionals up here involved and whatever, and I hired a forensic accountant, we found out that was when this man got himself into their lives and started cleaning out the bank account. And he couldn't have me taking my parents as a dependent, because then I would know. I mean, I knew everything about the banking. I would call up the bank, and I had a personal relationship with the banker. I would call to say, hey, Beth, what's going on these days? And we would talk about my parents' money and their investments and how they're doing, for the last 6 months or whatever. And the perpetrator couldn't have me doing that anymore. And so he managed to talk my parents into into becoming independent of me and my husband. So, that's the kind of thing that, had I been educated on this topic, and that's part of why I do interviews and do presentations.
Sure.
Had I known anything about it, I would have flown down there right away. And I would have stayed down there until I met somebody and said, and realized this person is the perpetrator. But I had no clue. But the bank didn't call me. And their accounts, I mean, it was an awful lot of money. So large amounts of money were coming out, and Beth knew me. And yet she never once called me to say, you know what, Pamela, this is kind of strange, because your mother and father have been customers of this bank for the last 35 years, and now all of a sudden $10,000 deposit, $10,000 coming out here, $20,000 coming out there, and she should have called, but nothing ever came. She didn't report it to the police. She didn't do anything.
It's terrible.
Yeah, I'm not saying that because I'm looking for sympathy. Yes, it's terrible. The point that I want your listeners to get is that they really do need to be proactive about this. They need to know that most of the time the victim is going to be a female and at least 80 years of age, and most of the time she's going to be, I think 75% of the time, according to the Illinois Department on Aging, she's going to be Caucasian. She's going to either have lost her husband, or like in my mom's case, my dad was living in a nursing home.
Sure.
Like she lost him. She's going to be isolated from other people in her family, like she was from me and my brother, either by estrangement or just by geography. I mean, these are things that people have to pay attention to. Call the bank and say, hey, anything weird going on, any large withdrawals or you can do. You know, there may be $10,000, $20,000 gone, but it's sure as hell better than several $100,000 gone.
Now, in our closing moments together, and I mean, this is such, I'm going to use the word wonderful, not that the subject is wonderful, but it's wonderful information. And circling this back to and through Mickey Rooney and out to, you know, Tony D'Angelo or people who, you know, were not Mickey Rooney. Why was nothing done, in your estimation, in the case of Mickey Rooney? And assuming what Mickey said, that if it can happen to Mickey Rooney, it can happen to anybody, what are just some good points we can all use so that this doesn't happen to us or anyone else we know?
Well, in Mickey's case, it was his wife's son. You know, his last wife was the one that he was married to the longest.
The longest, yes.
Yeah, and he had been married like 5 times before then or something like
I think it was 7, but okay.
You know, however many times.
Yeah.
But he was very much in love with her, and he was in love with her even at the very end of his life. And she probably knew, but yeah, I mean, it was very difficult. He couldn't speak out. He said that it was finally the people at Disney who became aware that something horrible was going on. The taxes weren't being paid. He had no food in the refrigerator. And somebody at Disney finally sent in this attorney who I did have the privilege of meeting. And he took over Mickey's life. They had to go to court, and he became Mickey's conservator. Some places they'll call it a guardian.
Yeah, or a conservator in our jurisdiction, yeah.
Right, exactly. So he was the one who had power over Mickey's body and over Mickey's finances. And I think they call it over his person and
right.
finances.
Person and property, right.
And then he literally he evicted the son, the stepson, and eventually he evicted the wife. Because when my interviewers were there, the wife literally physically abused Mickey right in the presence of my cameraman. So of course, they didn't say anything, but they called me, and I called the lawyer, and the lawyer had her removed from the house because they needed to get her away from Mickey. But he never said anything, partly because his son kept saying, I beg your pardon, his son and his wife, he would say, well, how much money did I make at the end of this film? And they would say, oh, you know, a certain amount of money. And he would say, wow, that seems like a very small amount of money. And then, and they would say, well, you know what, don't talk about it because, you know, we're looking out for you. We're the ones who are taking it, you know, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
We're the ones who are responsible, you know, we're looking out for your money and all of that. And, excuse me, got a little butterfly in my...
No, I understand. That happens to me often.
I need to take a drink.
Take your time.
I'm interrupting.
No, it's perfectly okay.
So, anyway, so they told... There's a portion of it that's really like willful blindness,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to admit to yourself that this horrible thing is happening. And it's a family member, and it's very hard to report. In my case, it wasn't a family member, but there is a financial cost to any prosecution, and there are a lot of municipalities that will weigh. Now, of course, they won't. If the money is returned, they don't get that. But if they arrest somebody and then they prosecute him, and then that person is finally convicted, then the judge says, well, you have an X amount of dollars
Oh, neat.
Yeah, so that's probably why nobody ever did anything. They didn't say that, but I spoke to the DA in New York City, one of the ADAs in New York City, and when we did our premiere in Manhattan, and she said that in fact they don't have one of those thresholds, but she does know that they exist. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the elderly are so easily financially abused. So that's why I go around, and because if I can help people stop it from happening to begin with, then even if you don't have an enlightened police force in your town, at least, you can take care of yourself.
Now, as far as quote unquote in our waning minutes, to stop it from happening, just a few kind of useful things for the toolbox people should be aware of.
Okay. First thing is the biggest enemy of the elderly is isolation. If you have, in my case, had I known, I would have hired somebody to be there to check on them on a very regular basis. But isolation is the big thing, because when somebody feels isolated, they will gravitate towards somebody who's going to pay attention to them. And so that's dangerous. If there's somebody from a different generation suddenly paying lots and lots of attention, not just befriending somebody, because you can be, I'm friends with people of all different age groups, but somebody who's all of a sudden becoming too close to them very quickly, somebody who might be asking for all kinds of favors, something like that. If they notice that the property is not being taken care of, or if the person themselves are not being taken care of, properly, if they, I don't know, they look like they're losing weight because they don't have food.
Something looks odd, yeah.
Showing up at church or something like that.
I believe me, you've given us a ton of things to think about, and as my mother would say, you're out there doing God's work, and I so much appreciate it. Where can
Can I do a little shameless self-promotion before we sign off?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so the name of the film is called Last Will and Embezzlement, and there's a website by the same name, lastwillandembezzlement.com. So if anybody is interested in purchasing the film, or there's also a book that's a companion piece to the film, they're both there on the website. And I'm Pamela F.K. Glasner, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter and accessible through my website.
Well, you were so kind to actually do the lead ad for me, and I am so appreciative of that, Pamela. But I'm grateful that you've been here today, and I thank you so much for that. And I'm sure we'll be talking again, probably not under the best of circumstances, but as things develop in this area. And thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Pamela. And we're going to be heading out here with the Bee Gees. Listen to me, Beach Boys. I was listening to the Beach Boys before I came out. Loving you inside and out. And Pamela, take care. We will talk soon.
Okay, thank you.
A wonderful interview. I'm just so pleased, and we will be back again really soon. We thank Pamela Glasner. A horrible subject, but something we need to know. And for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, with Rick Nelson playing in the background, my boy! We're going to see you back here real soon. God bless and have a great week, everyone.